Welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. In this video, I'll be analyzing the dungeons of the original Final Fantasy. If you don't already know, Final Fantasy is a science fantasy JRPG that came out in 1987. It greatly affected the JRPG genre and was the first installment of a long-running series. This game has complex dungeons, and after analyzing the dungeons of the original Dragon Quest games, let's see how Final Fantasy affected JRPG dungeons. The first dungeon is the Chaos Shrine, a shrine where the characters rescue a princess and encounter the main villain, Garland, for the first time. It has some treasure, but most of it is behind locked doors that you need a key to access. And it's only one floor, but at the end of the game you can go back in time and explore some lower floors, which I'll get to later. This makes it one of the JRPG dungeons that you are required to come back to later on. The second dungeon is the Marsh Cave, a loot dungeon you go in to find a crown. The monsters are very hard to get past to the point where you might as well not even try to get through until you reach level 10. It gives 3 choices on where to go from the start, where 2 of the choices lead to stairs and 1 leads to a dead end. 1 staircase leads to more treasure, while 1 leads to empty chests and a path to the largest room, the 3rd floor. In the 3rd floor, there are 16 small rooms, and 4 of them are inaccessible until you get the magic key, but that still leaves a bunch to choose from, and the crown is in one of them. The one with it is protected by 2 monsters. Overall, this dungeon has many choices and is a pretty good size, but the monsters are overwhelming and it doesn't have any puzzles. Shortly afterwards, you get the magical key, so you can go back to the last 2 dungeons and get more weapons. The next dungeon is the Cavern of Earth, a really big dungeon where you can get through most of it and defeat a mini-boss, but need a rod from a sage to get to its lower levels. To get to him, there's a simple pathway dungeon called the Titan's Tunnel. It has some treasure to find and leads to the sage's cave. The Cavern of Earth is very large and has many different paths. It's very complex with many different paths to take, and the treasure is scattered pretty well. Despite the complexity, the labyrinth isn't too hard to get through, as on most of the floors there are multiple ways to get through. It has 5 floors, all are very big. There are some areas swarming with monsters, where every step will have a random encounter. The monsters in this dungeon are very difficult to get through. The most dangerous monsters you've fought up to this point are there, along with some extra monsters, and some of them are Earth-themed. Mummies, spiders, ogres, and specters are common. Some of these monsters cause special conditions that you will have to work around. Some monsters cause paralysis, poisoning, and there's a mythical bird that turns people to stone. It's very hard to get through, but this is a pretty good dungeon with 2 boss battles. After beating the first boss, a vampire, you need a magic rod to access the lower levels, which ultimately leads to a battle with a lich, an undead sorcerer that tampered with the earth crystal, which ultimately harmed the world. After beating him, you light the crystal and move on. The next dungeon is Mount Gulg, a volcano dungeon with 5 floors. The surface is very hot and will slowly hurt your party members, but monsters won't attack you on them, so running across the hot surface may be your best bet. The first floor is very small, but the other floors are much bigger. The second one has a whole room with optional treasure. The 3rd floor is large, but is void except for a staircase to the lower level. Then, the 4th level is the same, but leads upward to another section of the 3rd floor, that's also void, except for a path to another section of the 4th level with lots of treasure. Most of it is guarded by monsters. Also, if you take 1 item called a soft, a lot of the treasure in the final floor will disappear. Then there's the final boss that you need to beat to complete the dungeon. Every floor of this dungeon has a different shape and gives the player some choices, but most of these choices are just sections with a large amount of places to get treasure, and the monster encounters are very difficult. The next dungeon is the Cavern of Ice, an icy cavern where you need to find a floater artifact called a Levistone in the remake. It's a little linear, but it has some treasure chests with monsters set to guard them. It also requires the player to avoid potholes that make you fall into a lower level where you'll struggle to get back up, and there are some areas that hurt to walk across. In order to get the magic stone, you have to find a magic room with a pothole leading to the one place you couldn't get in, then you have to beat an eye monster for the floater, then you can go back to the higher floor, and there's a staircase that takes you directly out. This dungeon is pretty linear, but it's well rounded. The next one is the Citadel of Trials, a dungeon full of puzzles where you can find a tail that you need to take to the dragons, and they'll give you more powerful job classes for the rest of the game. You need to take a crown you got from the Dark Elf King just to enter the many trials. It's full of pillars that teleport the player around in circles, and you have to figure them out to make it into the final floor with a zombie dragon boss. The dungeon is a labyrinth with many different monsters at the end. It forces the player to get out of the many teleporting pillars and defeat several set encounters for treasure. To get through the pillars, you have to keep searching every one until you find the one path that doesn't lead to a dead end. Like some labyrinth dungeons, there are many paths, but all lead to dead ends except for one certain path the player has to figure out by guessing. If you pick the wrong one, then you'll have to go back through some. Fortunately, it's not very far to go, so this is still an enjoyable dungeon. Monster-wise, it has some new monsters, such as Medusas and clay golems, but most of them are just monsters that are already in the game. The next dungeon is the Sunken Shrine, an underwater dungeon beneath the mermaid's home. It's 5 floors and is very long and maze-like. Not only that, but you also have the option of which direction to go from the start. This dungeon gives the player a major choice. If you want, you can go up first and mingle with the mermaids and steal treasure, or you can go down first and fight the dungeon boss. Also, at this level in the game, it's more fun because you're at a much higher level, so the difficulty is at a more appropriate level. Also, each level has a different water tint. It's pretty non-linear, and the treasure is scattered pretty well, and the difficulty is balanced really well. The next dungeon is the Waterfall Cave. It's just a small cave dungeon players have to enter to find a warp cube, an artifact needed to reach one of the later dungeons. This cavern is also 1 floor, and is only a string of paths with dead ends, and one path leading to the treasure. This makes it a loot dungeon and a labyrinth dungeon. However, the treasure is all in one place, and very few of the monsters are new. The next 2 dungeons are back to back. You have to go through the first one and use the warp cube to access the next. One is pretty quick to get through, while one is much longer and has a different aesthetic. The first one is the Tower of Mirage in the desert. Like a lot of the dungeons of Dragon Quest II, it's a tower dungeon, but it's only 3 floors and is pretty linear. It's full of treasure that you will have to go looking for. There are a few robots, and there's a point where you can teleport to a space station in orbit using the warp cube. The walls of this dungeon are maze-like and different from the average walls, despite rarely affecting the main path. It has some new monsters such as Black Knights and Chimera, but most of them are just taken from the rest of the game. At the end, there's a blue dragon to get past. The next dungeon is the Flying Fortress. It's a space station with the air crystal and all kinds of monsters. Many of these monsters are rare or only in this dungeon. Plus, it has air elementals and sentries relating to this dungeon's theme of science fiction and the element of air. It also has the iconic death machine, the war mech, a robot that you probably won't encounter, but if you do, it may decimate your party, as it's more powerful than even the main boss of the dungeon, the Tiamat. This dungeon also looks different from the rest of these dungeons because it's in space. It's 5 floors, and the first 3 of them are like Mount Gulg, with many different directions, with treasure in all of them. But you can easily get through it if you know where to go, and only one path leads to the next floor. The 4th floor is a puzzle room, where you keep going around in circles unless you take the right path. The last floor is a long bridge leading to the boss. It's also the only place where you can encounter the war mech. Then there's one last dungeon, the Chaos Shrine. the dungeon from the beginning, just in the past due to time travel. It has 8 floors and is full of the most dangerous monsters in the entire game, along with all the fiends from the 4 dungeons with crystals. You have to beat every last one of them if you want to get to the end. In the beginning, you can only get to the bottom of the first floor. It has 2 staircases where one leads to a dead end in the basement and one leads upwards to a small room in the second floor where you can only go up to the 3rd floor. In the 3rd floor there's a puzzle where you need to use an instrument given to you by the princess of the nearby castle to open a staircase to the lower level that you were just at but could only get through one room. It will take you to the first floor's upper section, allowing you to access the only staircase you couldn't reach before. It will take you to the basement section, which will give you access to the rest of the dungeon. The first few floors don't make much structural sense, similar to the dungeons of the original Dragon Quest, as the staircases don't line up with where you end up in the building structure, but afterwards you can go to the 4 lower levels with all the bosses of the game. This makes the dungeon a boss rush, a segment of a game littered with bosses that you've already beat. The second basement floor has an easy path to a staircase in the 3rd underground floor and a few detours leading to treasure. The 3rd one doesn't, but like the second one, it has a tricky way to get through. But the 4th floor has another detour. The last floor is just a circular room full of pillars in triangle shapes. In the center there's the final boss of the game, Chaos, the ultimate form of the knight from the beginning. Overall, the Final Fantasy dungeons are slightly different from the first 2 Dragon Quest dungeons. These dungeons are extremely long and have more difficult random encounters. To get through, you'll need to get lucky with the amount and intensity of them. They're also mediocre when it comes to non-linearity, as many of them have a straight path with some detours to find treasure and dead ends. However, many of these dungeons have monsters that suit the theme, such as water monsters in the Sunken Shrine, and air monsters and robots in the Flying Fortress. Also, each of these dungeons looks different from each other, which is a problem with the first 2 Dragon Quest games, mainly the first one. Also, the shapes of the individual rooms are different across all of them. Many are intriguing, and these dungeons are different from many JRPGs, as these dungeons have small houses inside them where the treasure is. But despite its flaws, these dungeons are a good way to start the long history of Final Fantasy dungeons. Thanks for watching.